Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. And today I have a good one for you. That I promise. Saka and Isak to Joao Pedro and Salah. We'll be assessing that in detail, giving you slightly different perspectives as well. All of the defenders that need to be covered are likewise with the midfielders and the forwards, and a changing trend within, well, I guess the defensive assets as a result of change in football. We've also looked at some other things, just to touch on wildcard strategy for those who missed yesterday, some potential moves down the line, and some other pretty cool stuff. So if you do enjoy, please do consider subscribing. And without anything else needing to be said, let's get into it. Within the community at the moment, one of the biggest topics is, should we move Saka and Isak to Salah and Joao Pedro, or at least should we complete a variation of that? And before we delve into the analysis here, there is one thing I would like to say. I do expect Salah and Joao Pedro to outscore Saka and Isak as a combination over the next 2 game weeks. However, I think whilst that is statistically likely, or likely as a result of my analysis, I do not think that's means for grounds to essentially make the move just on that basis. And why is that? Well, I'm going to go into that now. But like I said, we must make projections. And my projections are that as a combination, they outscore them. And we'll go into individual predictions in a little bit. I would like you to consider one thing, however, before we go into the footballing analysis. Each transfer, I think you should give it a weight of 4 points, because that's how much an extra hit costs. And when making a transfer, I would always look at what real alternatives you have, and then essentially plan what would happen down the line if you made those. As an example, I would just use my own team. One thing I'm considering is going Son to Eze. Something else I'm considering is Hall to Robertson. Now, either of those moves lead to very different paths down the line. If I do Son to Eze this week, I'll likely do Hall to Porro next week. If I do Hall to Robertson this week, who knows? Maybe I'll keep Son. Maybe I'll make another defender. Maybe I'll sell Emil Smith-Rowe next week. But my point is, if I was to bring in Salah and Joao Pedro and they outscore Saka and Isak in the next 2 weeks by 5 points, what if the transfer I was going to make down the line, which is now reversed, would have benefited me in a 10-point swing? Then I would have lost points. And it won't appear like that on the surface. They will appear as 2 separate outcomes within my team. But realistically, they're linked together because this was the catalyst for that. And for that reason, I really do think that you should assess all paths, and not just from a 1 week standpoint, but also 2, 3, 4, however you think your team is best suited to which particular timeline. Right, now why am I bullish on Salah? Well, I think Forest have been one of the most pragmatic teams in the league in an era where pragmatism is certainly dying. So that's a good thing and not a good thing for Salah. However, when I watch them, as pragmatic as they are, as good as the defensive structure is, it's not elite. And I certainly think with the quality that Liverpool have, they can cause them problems. I watch Matthias Cunha in particular cause them problems purely due to his quality alone. Now, Forest are a good side, but I wouldn't say they have world-class players. I would say their better players are certainly at the front end of the pitch as opposed to the back. And therefore, I do really think that Liverpool could leverage their quality, creating chances even against a well-disciplined, well-structured block. So that's that. I think they won't blow them away, but I expect them to do well. The second thing is that I really like the Bournemouth fixture. When Bournemouth travel away to sides, I expect them to concede. You look at the Iraola high press, and what I found is it can be bypassed somewhat often away from home when the pitch is a little bit bigger. It's a good press. I think he's a very good coach, and it's a good press, but other sides will certainly have the quality to bypass it. None more so than Liverpool. And when they do, I think Salah will find himself in a lot of isolated situations. I say somewhat in a similar fashion to Old Trafford, because the mechanism as to how it develops and how he gets there will be entirely different. But I do think he's going to get some isolated situations as a result. If you watch their backline, for example, against Newcastle definitely had that, and they didn't really exploit it due to arguably a lack of 1v1 threat, especially with Gordon playing on the right. You probably want him on the left to exploit that. But Liverpool, they won't have any problems with that, and no one will have a better chance of exploiting it than the 1v1 demon that is Mohamed Salah. So I just think he does very well, and I have nothing really bad to say about him. However, if you're not going to captain him in game week 4, where Haaland's probably the best choice, the real upside lies in 5. So could you not just wait a week? Could you not at least postpone the move? And then who knows, maybe an opportunity presents itself whereby the move doesn't actually need to be made next week because a new opportunity presents. So for this week, I don't see enormous upside. I think Saka could definitely haul away at Spurs. And I think, yeah, sure, Salah could haul against Forest. But I would rather have the move in the bank where I know that the upside is in captaining him in game week 5. So that's where I stand with him. Even though I expect him to do well, I don't think he's going to do ridiculously well compared to his competition. Justifies moving that type of money and using transfers this week. Joao Pedro, again, I pretty much only have good things to say about him. I will call him the Giant Slayer because I think he's going to be someone who does very well against the big teams. I think Brighton have a wide variety of weapons. I think they can break down the better teams given the quality in attack and also the fluidity in the system, which has certainly been coached into them. But then also, I don't see them struggling to break down a block like Man United do. So against the lesser teams, quote unquote, they'll be okay. And at 5-5, with good expected minutes, good fundamentals, penalties, quality in the final third to actually deliver output, I really liked Joao Pedro. Now, what are his prospects against Ipswich and Forest? Again, I don't think Forest will blow over, and I think they could be somewhat difficult. Against Ipswich, you would expect them to do well, but there's no side, maybe apart from Southampton, at the moment, who look like they're just going to get battered when they go away from home to a significantly better team. I wouldn't be surprised if Ipswich only concede like 2. And for that reason, whilst I do think Joao Pedro is a good option, the spread of output at Brighton is already quite large, and I don't think you can be expectant of a haul. Sure, you can be expectant of a return, but I don't think with a player like Joao Pedro in that Brighton side, you can be expectant of a haul. But then again, it begs the question, is this a move that needs to be made in 4? Do Isak and Saka not have enough prospects this game week to potentially outscore this duo here? Because I actually think the upside lies in 5 for Salah and Joao Pedro, for you to at least delay this move by a week. Now, the other thing is, I only have good things to say about Saka and Isak as well. And overall, this definitely is a marginal call, and I'll give a conclusion on it at the end, but you can probably see it. I think Newcastle haven't been as bad as people say. I actually think they've generated enough situations for themselves within the game where had they been a little bit more clinical, had the final pass been a little bit better, had the decision making been a little bit better, just the last one, the scores of the games that they've had would look very different. I cast my mind back to Bournemouth. Isak had a good chance, which he didn't take. Isak also nearly got on the end of one, and he was very, very close to getting on the end of one. Barnes should have slipped him in. He made a lot of runs beyond the last line, and it was just the final pass they were lacking. Spurs, I mean, he walked away with a 9-pointer. Yeah, sure, he wasn't particularly impactful, but besides that, Newcastle are going to play in the next 2. They're not as good as Spurs. Yeah, Spurs have their defensive issues. To be fair, I actually think they're a little bit better this year. Then you have Sandro Tonali come back, who will help in all phases of the game. Drops deep and in build-up just to speed them up a little bit. I also think in the final third, whilst that's not his forte, he will certainly help there because their midfield really is lacking when Bruno Guimaraes is the 6. So I don't actually think Newcastle have been that bad. I really don't think Isak has been that bad either. I think he's been in those positions, somewhat similar to Kai Havertz, making a lot of runs beyond the last line that haven't been found. However, Havertz has still managed to profit a little bit more. Honestly, I wouldn't be concerned. And he's had a good international break, a decent rest given the timing of his last game. So overall, I think it's fine. Saka in the big games is what I would call the biggest weapon Arsenal have in their side to break down these type of teams. I remember the game against Villa, and I was watching it just pleading for them to just give the ball to Saka because every time he gets it, the quality of his attacking actions is so high that he will almost make something happen, especially compared to the rest of his teammates. I mean that with the greatest respect. So against City, I expect him to take a huge amount of responsibility, and thus with a high volume of attacking action. I do think there was certainly the opportunity there for him to get a return. And given he's on penalties, there's always a haul regardless of the fixture, I think, with Saka. I think also he has a really high floor, at least, given the volume of attacking actions. And Spurs is a pretty open game. Sure, Odegaard's not there. Honestly, I don't think that's a particularly big deal. We'll go into that more in the Havertz section. But I don't think it takes away from Saka dramatically. If it was against a low block and a proper low block, sure, I think you can argue that Odegaard's very effective. But in a game that's very transition-based, a game that will be a little bit basketball style, Odegaard, well, that's not really his game, right? I think nowadays it's helping in earlier phases of build-up and then being in the final third when you want to break down the block. But in terms of quick transitions and leveraging your physical capacity, that's not really Odegaard's bread and butter. So I don't think it would be that big of a deal for the game, for either of these 2 games. So whilst I expect him to do well, I'm really bullish on Salah for the next 2, and I think essentially he will take Joao Pedro over the line to outscore them. I just don't think it's going to be by the biggest extent in the world. I think we could also reassess in game week 5. And I just think that when you look at the value of the 2 free transfers being 8 points and the fact that you could use it elsewhere, I think that could be a better spot to take than removing 2 fundamentally very, very sound assets. So for me, whilst it's a marginal call, at least in game week 4, I would. Now, you might be wondering, Gian, why is Iozo Perez on this slide? And It will make sense in a minute. We'll start with Gabriel and Porro in particular, right? I would start Gabriel because I think Spurs are poor defensively from set pieces, and he's an absolute monster in the air. So it's a nice avenue. I would also say that even without Rice, they have a higher chance of keeping a clean sheet because they are a significantly better defense, even without their best midfielder and one of the best midfielders in the world, right? Yeah, sure, Porro is going to get, again, probably a high volume of attacking actions compared to what most fullbacks would, that right side 10 role, but I do think it'll be somewhat neutralized given what he'll have to do defensively this game and the fact that Arsenal are just very good. So they'll limit those and they'll be able to deal with it, especially if Timber is to play left back. I think his dueling capacity, if he ever gets close to Porro or one of the centre backs is very aggressive, or there's a pivot in front of them in some form and they essentially close that space compared to if it was a standard 4-3-3, I do think there will be a reduction in what you see from Porro in a normal game. Then again, the argument with selling Gabriel, which is something I've seen from people, is my question becomes, how efficient of a transfer is this? Is it really worth 4 points when there is genuine attacking upside in this game and you would like him from 6 and there aren't that many good defensive options? I think football's really changing in the Premier League. I look at the fixture list now and people talk about good fixtures and bad fixtures for attackers. I just don't think there are that many bad fixtures for any attackers. Every team now is transitioning to playing in a way which is very positive, I guess you could call it. I personally think it's slightly suboptimal. I just don't think every team needs to be playing in a way which is so risk orientated, right? Like playing this, not even possession style of football, it's very direct football. A high volume of progressive passes through the middle, trying to transition so quickly, defending with a higher line, just trying to win the ball higher up with your style of counter pressing. I don't particularly think it's necessary, but that's what teams are choosing to adopt. And as a result, I think we're just going to see less and less clean sheets, which makes me think that defenders with genuine attacking upside, game in, game out, where there won't be huge variety of clean sheets just in general, nor will there be a lot of bonus points offered to defenders given the change in the system. I just think the likes of Porro from Gaming 5, given how attacking he is, could actually be a really good option. And I am leaning towards going with defenders like Robinson, like Porro, and starting to not worry too much about clean sheets in comparison to the boss. Obviously, I'm still going to look to target good fixtures because, for example, maybe the Everton attack isn't as good as the Wolves attack, which is a true statement in my opinion. But I'm not going to be I'm not going to give it as much weight and importance in my decision-making process as I would in the past compared to attacking output from defenders. Hence why I always say Prez is there, because they beat Southampton 9-0 and this was the goal he scored and he celebrated. So I was just showing you that defenders conceding a lot of goals. Last thing, just because Arsenal have lost Rice, it's literally for one game. This is a long, long game we're playing. Don't forget that they're the best defense in the league. And just because they've got 2 tough fixtures, and they do, don't think that they're incapable of keeping them clean. Because they kept a clean sheet against City last year twice, and they really got close to keeping a clean sheet away at Spurs. Now, this is a different year, and I actually expect them to probably concede in both games. Maybe not so much in the Spurs, but I still think you have to value the defense in a slightly different way to the rest. Now, I've seen not too much negativity, but not too much positivity surrounding Emile Smith-Rowe, and I actually think he's been really sound so far. The game against Ipswich, people were talking on the timeline about his positioning, and honestly, from what I saw, I didn't think it was that bad at all. I mean, Iwobi laid him off for one in the second half. Muniz got to a header where Emile Smith-Rowe was already in the box and certainly could have got to a rebound. He was always central. He was never dropping deep, staying there and helping in build-up. Rather, if he was going to drop deep and help him build up, it was quick. He was in and he was out. Unlike someone like Bruno Fernandes when he does it, for example, right? Given Man United's constraints at the moment as a result of their midfield and bargain, however you wish to criticize them. And as a result, I think he's probably been underappreciated now. 5 points per game at his price is really good, especially when you consider his quality of ball striking at different angles, which will always lead to goals. The fact that he's playing in such a good role for Fulham, and the fixtures are, I think, fine. I mean, West Ham at home, Newcastle at home. Given they're at home, I think that's fine. And you expect his expected minutes to improve as a result of the international break and him just getting more and more minutes. So I don't think he's anywhere near as much of a sell as people are being made for it to be. I don't mind Minteh on a wildcard, and he was in my wildcard team because I think we're going to take the upside in the next 2 weeks. He's well rested. He's a very good player. There are a lot of things I like about him. He's brilliant in small spaces, knows how to manipulate, good ball striking, good on the ball, etc., etc. Right? So by all means, But I do think that with free transfers, this isn't the most efficient use. And this was prompted by a move I saw, which was Smith Rowe to Minteh. And sure, there's more upside in Minteh for the probably right given the fixtures. But Smith Rowe still got goals in him. And will you really want Minteh after 5? Probably not, because you're still gonna probably have an expected minutes problem there, because Adringer will be constantly knocking on the door. At least you'll have early subs. You have Brighton's spread of output problem anyway. And thus, I think if you're on wildcard, fine, because the rest of your squad will be optimized now, so you don't need to spend as many transfers on the rest of it. But where you're going to have problems with a slightly suboptimal squad in any nature that's not a wildcard, I don't think it's worth it to go for Minteh personally, because I just don't see huge amount of upside being there. I think it's unlikely he holds. Moving on to the two Liverpool midfielders, I'm not as hot on them, and I never have been, as others are. And my main reason is purely expected minutes. If they were to play 90 week in, week out, great. But Nunes and Gakpo are not just going to sit on the bench every single game. Nunes did not go on international break. Liverpool have got a pretty intense schedule when they get back, given the Champions League. And I do think Nunes will just eat into his minutes. Even if it's 60-30, 65-25, 70-20. With the volume of options at that price point, and even, to be honest, 7.5 is a little bit expensive. When Eze is cheaper and Mbeumo is cheaper, you can get Gordon for the same price. You can get Bowen for the same price, who we're going to come on to. I just think like you really should be taking 90 minutes. And you're risking potentially him being benched for one game here or there anyway. Okay, so that's why I don't really like Jota long term. I think this is the perfect time to exit. You want to go Eze? He has a nice fixture. You want to go Mbeumo early? Okay, like you could probably put that move off for a week, but after this week, I would make it. And there are other moves like that. Diaz is just very, very similar. I also don't think his output is sustainable at this level. He's never really shown that he's this type of player that can be this clinical, and I do expect somewhat of a decline, especially when you consider that again he may see himself in reduced minutes with the Champions League. You've got Gakpo there. The main thing for me is I don't think the output is sustainable. I could be wrong, but the numbers prior, and I'd say his finishing in prior seasons is reflective of that. Okay, so here are the 5 forwards that I think really need to be discussed this week. How will Havertz do without Odegaard? Where will he play? Well, overall, I think he's fine. I think this is a long game, and if you're wildcarding this week, you don't really want to be booking too many transfers, right? A lot of Wildcard 4 already have 2 transfers booked in Wildcard 6, which I think is a problem in itself to an extent, and we'll come on to that later. If Havertz is to play midfield this game, okay, it's not the end of the world. Arteta changed the dynamic anyway in preseason so that his right centre mid is the one more involved in build-up. The left centre mid acts as a second striker specifically because Havertz, his profile allows for that. Zinchenko or Timber will invert from the left to help with progression from deep and build-up. So I think even if he is to play left centre mid, against Spurs especially, where you have someone who can crash well because of how they play, and also if he's able to stretch the line still from left centre mid, he'll be absolutely fine. I don't really have much bad things to say about him, and he could just play 9 anyway. Okay, there's some talk about them going 4-2-4 on the timeline. There's some talk about other people playing in the midfield, etc., etc. So I think where he has such good long-term prospects and good fundamentals, and you'll really want him from 6, on the assumption that you just keep him and just let things play out. Is Nicholas Jackson worth it? So I say there are 2 different schools of thought. One is the fact that he accumulates such a high volume of chances. The expected minutes look pretty good at the moment. The fixtures are decent. But the one that I come from, the school of thought that I come from, is that he's not super clinical. And therefore, I'm paying 7.5, which is the same as Bowen, similar to Eze and Mbeumo, that I'm never really too expectant of a haul. Because for him to get 2 attacking returns in a game, he has to either be somewhat clinical or the link-up play has to be very good. Now, he does have a good link play that also relies on others. And I think as a striker, you can't be too reliant on assists. And Chelsea have such a big squad. So what happens if other people start to play 9 and eat into his minutes off the bench and Maresca finds new solutions? Because I know he is one that iterates a lot. And I mean a lot. Mark Albrighton spoke about that on TalkSport as well. So with that in mind, I just think at that price, you can just do a bit better for yourself. For 1 million more, you can literally get Isak, and he is a brilliant asset. And for 0.5 more, you could get Havertz. And then for cheaper, you could get Joao Pedro. So for me, I don't like it. We'll come on to Watkins at the end because I think it's really tricky. Welbeck, I just don't like the selection. I think eventually he has to see some competition. I mean, Evan Ferguson is such a good football player. The only reason he's not playing game in, game out is because of his age and his body and just allowing it to develop without getting injured. But eventually he comes into the side for a bit. Joao Pedro can play 9. Ruto will definitely need to get starts in that 10 role because he was their club record signing, right? And Welbeck anyway isn't playing 90. And is he at the level to be able to sustain this output? Probably not. So whether a risk to be taken, go for it. I just don't think this is the most intelligent one. Actually, we'll do Watkins now because the narrative on Wood's pretty different. So Watkins, if you're an owner, I really don't like this spot. I feel a bit bad for you because I think you've been dealt a pretty bad hand. His fitness will be key, but even if he's fit, he's not getting 90. He doesn't look as sharp, and again, he's returning from another injury, or at least a long-standing one. John Duran looks razor sharp, and apparently Villa turned down 40 offers for him, so that would say that he's very much in the plans. Morgan Rogers, well, Emery seems like he's in love with him, so I can't see him getting dropped, and that's the front two. I guess maybe he's a hold if you know he's going to start in the next game, but I wouldn't be opposed to you jumping ship sort of early with all the variables at play that don't look particularly good for him. Chris Wood, however, on the opposite, I think could just be a really long-term hold. Awani almost seems slightly out of the picture now compared to before. I actually really like him as a player, and I think at his best, he is a hat. But with Wood getting 90 again last game, and the fact that his expected minutes, even if they're around 75, with the shot volume he's taking and the zonal dominance he has just in that center of the pitch, because Morgan Gibbs White drops deep, so he doesn't occupy too much of the space next to him and therefore won't have a massive share of that output. Everything also ends up at Wood's feet pretty much. I really like the prospects for him of just being a set and forget, really secure, good in the bonus points forward. And if you own him, I really don't see the rush to sell him to Joao Pedro. Sure, right? Joao Pedro has the better fixture this week. Again, is it the most efficient use of the transfer? Could you not just hold Wood and use that transfer somewhere else? Because Wood looks like he's got good prospects and good fixtures for a while. Definitely. Now, this section is an inspired section. I just really feel like talking about Eze. Definitely someone I'm considering bringing into my team. He's probably the front runner to do so. But he also encapsulates just a lot of things that I would like to discuss. Hence why I have this section. Okay. There is a lot of talk about risk-taking and catching the upside. And I think if you are to try and do that, you really need to pick a... I don't think Eze is the worst one in the world to do that. But let me explain the whole scenario. Firstly, I would like to touch on proximity theory, which is something I spoke about in my 20 team analysis video, but I'll speak about it again here briefly. You can look at that heat map of Eze and Semenyo, right? Now, Semenyo, by the way, has had more shots in the league than anyone else. For this, I haven't just picked a guy that's, not been involved. He's been involved. Look at essentially the really red bits of that. They're wide. And I know he's a winger and Eze has been playing as a dual 10, but they're still quite wide for a guy who's taken the most shots. So I tried to generate the fairest example because not many play Palace's system. Look at that. Look at it for Eze. And look at where he is. He doesn't have to go back too much to help with build-up, even as a 10, like others do. He doesn't have to carry as much as maybe Morgan Gibbs White does. He just gets to station himself in that left half space so consistently, and that too quite high up and move into central areas. He doesn't go too wide at all. And I just think that players of his quality in those positions where the ball will get to, and he has such dominance over that zone, therefore he's allowed to perform such a high volume of attacking action, I think he's undoubtedly going to generate returns. Okay. Secondly, forget the game against Chelsea because I think it's a bit of an anomaly in terms of what Palace will face in the next few. The game against West Ham and Brentford, he was very influential. I thought he was very sharp, and he was super the fact that owners didn't get a return in those two is honestly ridiculous, and I feel very, very, very lucky that I got away with that. But performance-wise, he himself, he looks great. And that paints a very pretty picture. There are two things, however. One, I have not been impressed with Palace, defensively especially, but even going forward, I just feel like there's a bit of an over-reliance on Eze at the moment. And secondly, I don't think this set of fixtures is actually that good. Leicester at home, yeah, it's solid. I don't think they're as bad defensively as people make them out to be, but it's still a good fixture, right? A very good one. Man United, I think it's better to play them at Old Trafford because I think they give you a bit more upside there for your attackers because they'll try to play in the Man United way, whereas I think away from home, like you look at the game against Brighton in the second half, you can see that many chances. Obviously, they conceded a 95th minute winner, which meant that the narrative in the media was worse than it actually was, but they weren't that bad defensively. Brighton really didn't create too much. Okay, so I don't think that'll be a rollover. Everton have a brilliant defensive coach under Sean Dyche, and I think you could only expect an improvement, especially if Branthwaite's back. Liverpool look really solid defensively, and I spoke about Forest having one of the better structures, one of the better defensive managers, and being one of the more pragmatic sides in the league. So, on the basis you don't think Palace improve, and you interpret the fixtures in the same way as me, if you're okay to fade Leicester at home and just try and get a little lucky, and understand that he has brilliant fundamentals and likely does return at some point. And when he does, there's a good ceiling there. He'll be good on the BPS because of the high volume of shots on target and +2 for that. I do think that this is one of those potential opportunities, should you have the risk appetite for, that you can take that risk and it's actually justified. I obviously waxed lyrical at the start about how I love the proximity from a standpoint of the proximity theory, how I love what he's been doing individually, how I think he's great in so many ways. But I do think there is a counter argument to be had that has not been delved into. And I just wanted to present you with both. And should you look to take a risk and really chase that upside, I do not think that this is the worst way in the world to do it. Now, there were just a few other things that I wanted to speak about. One, I think West Ham's attack, we'll forget their defense for a second. I think their attack looks sharp, especially Kudus and Bowen. Game week 6, Brentford, I think, especially when you go to theirs, you can get them. And then Ipswich at home in 7. Plan for that, potentially. I quite like it. I did a video yesterday on Wildcard 4, the team and strategy. So I didn't dedicate a section to it today. But if you haven't watched it, just go and watch the first 2-3 minutes on the strategy. A quick roundup and a new point. I really don't like the strategy because I don't think the upside is there. And I would say if you're going to wildcard, just make sure it's not as a result of fear, rather logic, intuition, or a combination of both. If you're super convinced that your non-Salah team needs it and he's going to go parabolic in the next 2 and you're going to captain him and you'll capture huge upside with himself and the Brighton boys against the Ipswich boys, then by all means go there. But don't do it just because it appears like a lot of other people are doing it on the timeline, or it appears like a lot of people are transferring Salah in. I would still say Haaland's a better option. I would still argue that your structure becomes somewhat compromised with him. I could argue that booking this amount of transfers is actually going to be suboptimal because there's always going to be opportunities that pop up that will be blocked by you doing this. So just make sure you're doing it as a result of logic and intuition, because then I think you can justify it as a result of fear. And then something I wanted to talk about, because it never really does, at least on my channel, but model users last season especially have done very well. And I've started to incorporate them more into my game for 2 reasons. One, to look at transfers, right? But also to help me plan. I think it helps me and gives me a really good idea of what potential solutions I could look at down the line. And it generates some new ideas for me. For example, I was never really thinking of making a defensive transfer this week until the model suggested it. So this isn't, by the way, part of the sales pitch to go and sign up to Fantasy Football Hub. If you would like to do so, there's 50% off in the description. But like I said, this isn't about that. This is just about your general usage of models and maybe adapting to a new phase of FPL. And that doesn't mean you need to take away from your eye test, right? Like, I'm still going to use my eye test to make most of my decisions, but I won't be so ignorant not to incorporate something that has been successful. Because, as the old saying goes, if you can't beat them, then join them. So I do think there is something to potentially be looked at there. And if you're not doing so, consider it. Because it is pretty cheap, right? And probably care about the game if you're this far in. And that is all she wrote for today. Thank you very, very much. I will be back on Friday for the team selection. If you haven't already, like the video if you did enjoy it. Subscribe to the channel. Comment whatever you would like below. And I shall see you very, very soon. Make sure to have a great day. Goodbye.